But the thing that you really need to decide then, once you've done all that stuff, is like, how are you actually going to progress this over time? Because progressive overload is the key driver for the adaptations that we want. And I don't mean, that's actually wrong to say. It's not the key driver. It's the key driver for keeping things moving in the direction that you want. It's not like you need to actually have a good program first, but to keep it being a good program, it needs to progress over time, right? So how do we do that? Well, there's a number of variables that we can look at that allow us to progress our training. And I actually think this podcast is going to be relatively quick, because if you understand these and you just start implementing them, maybe you understand the pros and cons, which we'll get to, you start to realize that progressing your training is actually incredibly easy. Right now, in the next podcast, we will actually talk about like periodization over time, because it does actually get a little bit trickier once you start, pushing out the time horizon. It's not just a 12-week program or, even a year program. It's like, how are you going to progress this stuff over the next 20 years of your life, but there are a number of variables that we can, look at to progress our training, right? And we'll start with the one that, pretty much everyone is aware of, which is adding weight to the bar, right? Or adding weight to the movement that you're doing, right? And that could be a small amount of weight, and that could be a huge amount of weight. But either way, the thought process is that if you are able to lift, 100 kilos on a certain lift for 8 reps, if you want to progress your training, the next workout, you're going to go to 105 kilos, or maybe 102.5 or 101.25, again, depending on what weights you have available to you. Well, that's even wrong. 102.5 was right, so like you're trying to progress it whatever way is possible, right? You're going, I'm going to add some weight to the bar, whatever the smallest weight increment is in my gym, or maybe again, like you see a lot of bodybuilders do this, where they literally be like, yeah, I train to the max every single week. And then the next time they do an exercise, they're like, oh yeah, I added 10 kilos to this lift. I'm like, well, that inherently means, unless you think you gain 10 kilos of an adaptation in a week, that inherently means that the last training session you did was not to your max, but that's a bit of a side tangent, right? But either way, whatever's happening, you want to add weight to the bar. You want to add weight over time. That's our first progressive overload method. So you've picked all your exercises, you've picked all your reps, you've picked all the amount of sets that you're doing, you've allocated it, you've designed up your program. You're now in the gym and you're like, cool, I've done 1 week of this program. It was great. I'm a little bit sore, but nothing excessive, right? The next week you go in, you're going, all of those lifts that I just did, I'm going to try add some weight to them, whatever, again, the smallest or whatever you think in your head is the most appropriate weight to add, right? What are the pros and cons of that, Gary? Like, is that the best way we can think about progressive overload? Is that the main one that we should be using? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So when it comes to adding weight to the bar or machine or dumbbell, etc., it works very well a lot of the time, because people like it. People like the idea of just being able to lift more weight. It's very clear when you're able to do something new on some exercises, like especially if you're doing something as pure as a 1 rep max. Like if you add 5 kilos and you've never done that before, you're like, okay, I've clearly progressed. I'm clearly better than I used to be. However, it doesn't work so well in isolation, because what a lot of people will do is they'll just focus on increasing the weight, and then they expect to be doing that on every exercise, every session, which is very, very messy. Generally, what you'll see is that early on in a program, you'll be able to add weight a little bit quicker, but that's primarily the result of, getting used to the exercises again. So for example, if you had been doing conventional deadlifts and then you bring in sumo deadlifts for a training block, you're regaining the skills. So in your first session, the weight's going to be considerably lower. It's actually below your level of true strength, because the skill and the tolerance for those movement patterns just isn't there yet. And then what you'll find is that the rate of progress in terms of adding weight to the bar, that'll begin to slow over a number of weeks then. But you can still continue adding weight to the bar. You just have to modify your expectations. So it might be plus 10 kilos week 1 on your deadlift, because it was just, you getting used to the exercise. Then it's kind of plus 5 week the second time around. And then you settle into a more normal rate of adaptation, where maybe you've been training for a couple of years and you're adding 2.5 to 5 kilos every few weeks in that training block, but you're comfortable enough coming back and sticking with the same weight. And that's something that's really important, because the rate of progress is never, ever, ever, when it comes to weight on the bar, going to be on a weekly level for more than a year. Because if you think about that, like you add 5 kilos to the bar, let's say a deadlift, 2.5 per side. You do that for every week, for 52 weeks. Are you going to be adding 260 kilos to your deadlift this year? No, of course you're not. You're not going to add that in 2 years or 5 years. Maybe if you started off really weak, you might do it in 5 to 10 years. But the point there is that like expecting to add weight every week or even every month beyond the beginner stage, it's just not very realistic. So what you have to do is appreciate that there's ways of varying the training stimulus beyond just the changes in weight on the bar, including using the double progression method, which is something that I use the vast majority of the time, really, where I'll give a client either a rep target and tell them that they can work around it, or a rep range, like let's say 8 to 10. And then what they'll do is they might do 8 reps at 100 kilos. And then the next session, they do 9 reps at 100 kilos. The next session, 10 reps at 100 kilos. And then they add maybe 5 kilos or whatever, 105. And that might push them down then to the 8 reps, 9 reps, 10 reps again. So you can go in that cycle. And that's actually quite sustainable for lifters that have been lifting for a few years, because even when you add the weight, the 5 kilos, you're going from 10 reps to 8 reps. So you might only be doing the equivalent of like, I don't know, 2.5 kilos extra because you're actually cutting the reps as well. So you're allowing yourself to make very small progression steps over the course of a training block. And that's something that can be super beneficial. With that said, it's also important to realize that, especially at the advanced level, when you're doing high levels of training volume and you're using things like RPE, for example, that you might have sessions where you actually regress, and that's also okay, because you're applying a certain level of training stress and you can adapt to that even if it hasn't been a progression on the previous session. You can still be moving forward because you're viewing the overall dose of training over a course of a number of weeks or months, as opposed to each individual session. Very much like calories, where if you've got your weekly calories in check, even if you had a bad Tuesday, but your weekly calories were still on point, you can still make progress. And it's just like this, where your second upper body session of the week mightn't have went so well, but the overall dose of training was on point for the week, and you can still be adapting. So a couple of points in there.
Yeah, like we definitely jumped onto a few other progressions.
Yeah, I kind of ran away with it.
This is the thing with it as well. It gets, once you get into the more advanced or even intermediate, you basically do need to start running a few different progression methods at once, maybe not directly at once, but you need to be thinking about these different progression methods, right? So we'll just say there's the first one, adding weight to the bar. That's our, generic, that's what everyone does. Excuse me, swear it's not COVID. But anyway, adding weight to the bar, that's what everyone does. That's the generic method. Now, the thing about that is, again, like Harry said, like it's not as clear cut as you initially think it's going to be, and you're not going to be adding weight to the bar every single week, right? And this will become more apparent in a second when we go through like RPE and or reps in reserve in a second, how you can see people going, oh, I'm adding weight to the bar every single week, when in reality, they're actually just modulating their RPE or reps in reserve, which we'll come to, right? And the one thing I do want to say about adding weight to the bar is that you are pretty much always going to be, and I say the bar, but I mean like whatever equipment you're using, just adding weight to that exercise, you are pretty much limited to whatever weight increments are in your gym. For example, dumbbells are a classic example. If you are trying to increase your weight on, I don't know, lateral raises, it's not very likely that this small muscle group here is going to just have a jump of like, 10% each week, So if you're doing lateral raises and you're trying to go from, I don't know, whatever, 10 kilo lateral raise, which would be, a decent lateral raise, to 12.5 kilos per hand lateral raise, like that's a 25% jump, isn't it? That's 25%. Yeah, 12.5. Yeah. So like, it's very unlikely. Like that'd be like, oh, I can bench press today. I just bench pressed 100 kilos. The next session, I'm going to do 125 kilos. You'd look at that and go, that's clearly ridiculous, right? But obviously, if your gym only has those small increments, then that's what you're going to have to deal with, right? So you're going to have to, on some exercises, not have a weight increase, which then we start thinking about different progression methods, which we'll get onto, right? But one way around that is, especially if you're someone that has, traditionally been able to add 2.5 kilos to the bar, you're just slowly been ticking that up, right? You can get smaller weight plates. You can get like micro plates. There's different names for them, but basically they'll sell them online on Amazon or whatever. And you can get smaller weight increments all the way down to like 0.1 kilo increments, so you can add small amounts of weight to the bar, which people have a little bit of resistance to, which is weird because it's like, oh, I'll add the weight that the gym says is okay to add to the bar, which is, generally the smallest weight increment in most gyms is 1.25 kilos. So they'll be like, oh, I'll add that to the bar. And obviously it has to be balanced on both sides. So that's 2.5 kilos, right? But for you might have only gained, or the adaptation that you've gained since the last session was only like 0.5 kilos, so you're not actually able for the next jump up. So for you, getting some micro plates might be a really beneficial method of continuing to add weight to the bar each and every single week, right? So that is one thing to be aware of, that even if you're not able to add weight to the bar every single week or whatever exercise it is, that doesn't mean that you're not adapting. You could just be adapting at a rate that's slower than the next rate or the next weight progression that your gym offers you, right? Which is really important to understand, because people can get quite disheartened when they see, oh, well, last week I did this weight and I should be up the next week, but I wasn't able to do it, right? And it's not the case. You probably did still adapt. You weren't as adapted to do the next exercise, or sorry, the next weight increase on that exercise,